Good morning. Thank you so much, Claire, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Julia VanSoelen-Kim, and I'm a food systems advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. And today I'll be talking about what many of you have been experiencing over the last many weeks, where we've had lots and lots of smoke in the air and ash falling on our homes and our environment. And I'll be sharing an overview of how wildfire smoke impacts the health and safety of our locally grown produce from our backyard gardens, our community and school gardens, and local farms. And this information draws from a UC Davis study, or a UC study done after our October 2017 wildfires that happened in Sonoma County and across the North Bay. The study was a unique partnership between the university and the community, and we call it civic science because it had a lot of engagement with community members helping to collect and contribute produce samples from their yards and their community gardens and farms. Ultimately, this study resulted in a scientific report, in a toolkit for other communities who are interested in doing this kind of science to investigate their own unique context, as well as a recorded webinar, which all of that is available online if you'd like to go into more depth. Next slide. So as I mentioned, my presentation focuses specifically on ash that fell on landscapes from distant fires. And later, Rob will go into more specific context of properties that were closely adjacent to and near structure burns or actual properties that had structures burned. So I want to keep that context in mind that in this study, I'm really talking about ash that was broadly distributed over a region. Next slide. And the central research question that we were investigating is the produce safe to eat after it's exposed to wildfire smoke and ash? And next slide. You'll notice, you'll recognize this from Claire's presentation. Next slide. And as I mentioned, smoke and ash moves through the environment, right? It comes through our air in these big smoke clouds, distributing ash onto the surface of plants and onto the surface of soil, and ultimately can move into water and through the environment, ultimately getting into our bodies. But in this case, we chose to really look at leafy greens because they had a large surface area that could be exposed to the greatest amount of smoke and ash. And they were also likely growing in October 2017, this time of year. So we looked at collards, lettuces, kales, and one other leafy green that doesn't come to mind now. Next slide. And this question really was coming directly out of the community's concern. So in fact, a UC Davis study that was done after the October 2017 fires that was conducted in 2018 found that a quarter of Sonoma County residents surveyed were concerned about the safety of their locally grown produce. And so this was very clearly on people's minds as we were out investigating this topic. We also got a lot of questions at our Master Gardener Help Desk around this. And for those Master Gardeners who are on the webinar today, that probably sounds familiar because again, we're in the same scenario where a lot of people are wondering if there's reason to be concerned. We also knew that farmers were unsure of the potential health impacts of the fires on themselves, their workers, and the consumers. Many farmers in our region were donating their produce to food pantries and emergency relief efforts. So they were really, really concerned about the potential adverse risk of their product and wanted to be well informed. And likewise, school, community, and home gardeners were asking about the potential impact for themselves, but also for the vulnerable populations that they served. Next slide. So diving into the background and the methods of this study that I'm sharing, in just over a month, while fires were still burning and still ongoing, we had 15 volunteers, many of whom were interested residents and master gardeners go to over 25 sites across the Sonoma County and collect 200 samples of leafy greens. Next slide. The sites that we collected from really were distributed across Sonoma County. So I know there's not a county boundary under this map, but you can see that this region that's showing is Sonoma County, and the T's are where our sample sites were. And so we had samples collected from across the region. The red on the map shows where our modeling indicated that smoke and ash deposition was the most intense. And that was the most intense ash from the urban burn area of Santa Rosa. We were able to sort of remove the other smoke from other fires and really concentrate on where we thought the most ash from the urban burn had been deposited. Next slide. And our basic study design, because these tests are extremely expensive and ultimately very cost prohibitive for the typical resident, we had to be really strategic with how many samples we tested. And so we were able to send samples from 2 sites initially to start generating our hypothesis. And then as time went on and as we were working to fundraise for analyzing these results, we also realized that the big elephant in the room was soil safety and whether we should also be looking at the effects of contaminants on the soil, since most of the produce had already been eaten or discarded at people's homes. So we added another component of collecting soil samples, and we were able to collect soil samples from 3 sites that we also had produce samples from. And then the last phase of our research looked at a cumulative risk assessment, or a holistic way of understanding the context of eating potentially contaminated produce in the context of knowing that our leafy greens are really healthy and nutritious. And so trying to understand in a more holistic view, what are the considerations? Next slide. In understanding this more holistic view, we have to understand, or we have to define for ourselves, what is unsafe. And so in terms of what is unsafe, we, for the produce, were able to use Proposition 65. And many of you are probably familiar with these, this label. You see it on the outside of buildings or on your coffee or your dried fruit that you may get. And it requires businesses to provide warnings to Californians about chemicals that could cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. And they use a no significant risk level, or an NSRL, which is a daily intake threshold that would cause fewer than 1 in 100,000 people in the exposed population to get sick. So I just want to underscore, this is a daily intake level. So it's saying, you know, if you were in this building daily, or if you were drinking this coffee daily, or eating these dried apples daily, then 1 in 100 people exposed in the population could potentially get sick. So it's seen as a very conservative measure of what's unsafe. For soil screening, for soil levels of measuring what's unsafe, we used information from the Environmental Protection Agency, from OHIA, or the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and also from Sonoma County's cleanup goals that were set for that fire during that time. And we'll be hearing more in a moment from Glenn about those cleanup goals. Next slide. So in summary, what did we find? First, overall, a big sigh of relief here. There was very low concern about chemicals on produce. So next. Sorry. No samples had detectable levels of lead, arsenic, mercury, or chromium, and so that's a huge sigh of relief. People were very concerned about lead and other heavy metals, and we didn't find any detectable levels. So that's really like the good news headline in our study. The second finding was that no samples had detectable levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. Next. We did have 12 out of 13 samples had no detectable dioxins and furans. However, one sample had detectable levels at concentrations that were below California's no significant risk level for determining safety under Prop 65. And 12 of 13 samples had no detectable Prop 65 heavy metals. However, one sample did contain nickel at levels that exceeded Prop 65. So if Prop 65 is here, the nickel levels were a little above. However, we learned that there's many different kinds of nickel, some of which is nutritious and some of which is not. And we weren't able to confirm what kind of nickel that was. And so it could have been nickel that's part of a normal diet and at a level that would have been not of concern. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I just mentioned for that last one that we do recommend washing produce in running water, and this is a common food safety practice regardless of ash contamination. It's always, you should wash your produce, wash your hands before and after harvesting, and wash your produce. But we did find that the nickel level was not present in the washed sample. We had washed and unwashed samples, and so we highly recommend washing produce in running water to mitigate any kind of potential risk there. Next slide. So in terms of soil, what we found is also a big sigh of relief. We had low concern, but we do believe that more research is needed, and I'll explain why in a moment. Go ahead, next. We found that heavy metal soil concentrations were below Sonoma County's cleanup goals, so that was really encouraging. We didn't see big concerns about lead or any other heavy metals. No samples had detectable polychlorinated biphenyls, or PBCs. Next slide. 3 sites closest to Santa Rosa, where the urban burn boundary was, had the highest levels of dioxins and furans, and the site closest to the urban burn boundary had levels of dioxins and furans that exceeded the EPA and OES soil screening levels. And the big caveat there, next, is that we are not totally able to confirm why that is, right? So we did a little bit of further testing and analyzed samples from elsewhere on that site, and we didn't find evidence of widespread dioxins or furans elsewhere on that site. So we hypothesized that the contaminants may have been unrelated to the fire, as they were not spread out across the site. But more research is definitely needed there to better understand why the dioxins were at higher concentrations as we got closer to Santa Rosa. Next. So with this in mind, with the idea that there was low produce risk and low soil risk with maybe the need for further testing, we wanted to take into account a more holistic understanding of risk. And so we used a cumulative risk assessment model that attempts to understand total risks in the context of the multiple vulnerabilities that we as individuals and as society have, and the multiple protective factors. So in this case, one of the most obvious protective factors is that eating leafy greens is healthy, and they provide important nutrition that also reduces cancer risk. And next slide. So with the help of an amazing graduate student, Vanessa Raditz, they were able to run the numbers and do the math and really understand that there was a net cancer risk reduction. And this slide is a little small, so I apologize, but I do want to go over just a little bit more of the detail. So when calculating a cancer risk reduction, we used a scenario where we thought it was possible, maybe not probable, but possible, that half of the 500,000 person population of Sonoma County increased their daily consumption of produce by 1 serving per day of local produce, I should say. So if they were eating local produce with a little residual ash that had fallen, and they ate 1 more extra serving of collards or kales per day for the rest of their life, that they would have a net cancer risk reduction from eating that local produce. And so that's really good news. And again, the other good news headline of our study. Next slide. So going back to our core research question, is it safe to eat the produce? And we really found that of all the things to be concerned about following a wildfire, produce safety is a low concern. There's a low concern of health impacts from ingesting produce from the urban wildfire smoke that was present in Sonoma County in 2017. As Susie said, every wildfire is unique and different, and so we want to take that into consideration, but we know that that particular fire had significant structure loss, and so we think that there was something unique there that merited us investigating further. And we found that the potential cancer risk reduction from the nutritional value of eating leafy greens outweighs the potential cancer risks of eating that produce exposed to ash and wildfire smoke. And ultimately, we want to really remind everyone, just like what Claire was saying, there are many considerations that go into determining who is most at risk. And so those who were closest to the fire want to take extra precautions. Those who have pre-existing vulnerabilities, such as chronic health conditions, people who are pregnant, children, and older adults should take extra health precautions and understand their own risk factors. Next slide. So to further reduce the potential minor risk that that is present in daily life and in our gardens, we encourage you to consider first and foremost what you and your loved ones and community are exposed to, and if you're concerned, take further precautions. And luckily, many of these precautions are good precautions regardless of who you are, where you are. They're just best practices. So the first and foremost is to protect your lungs during smoke events. Stay indoors. If you have to go outdoors, or if you're going outdoors to harvest, wear an N95 mask. Wash your hands before and after harvesting. Wash and remove outer layers of produce before eating, storing, and cooking. So in the case of leafy greens, you would want to remove the outer layers of lettuce on a head of lettuce, for example. And carefully remove any excess ash from surface areas. That's, I say careful, and should underscore that, because you don't want to get ash thrown back up in the air. Again, the biggest concern is around inhaling that ash. It's not around ingesting it. And so as you're cleaning ash from your residence, from your area, your deck, your garden, you want to be really careful not to toss that back up into the air. And then if you want to have further precautions, you can amend and cover soil with fresh mulch, fresh compost, or other clean soil as needed after a wildfire, smoke, and ash event. And you'll always want to promote good drainage, and you can use drip irrigation to reduce any kind of upsplash back onto the leaves, because again, you want to minimize any kind of ash or soil going back on the produce and getting potentially in a place where you could ingest it. And then you want to keep the outdoors outdoor. So you want to wear your garden shoes, you want to use a boot brush, remove your shoes before you come back in, and keep in mind that, pets and children often track dirt into the house. So be aware of just trying to keep as much dust and ash outside of your house to reduce further exposure. Next slide. In closing, I wanted to share this social media graphic that we have from our study, really summarizing our findings in a nutshell. And you can look to UC Cooperative Extension social media during wildfire events. We try and push this out as a good reminder of our study's findings. Again, the first and foremost tip is to protect your lungs, stay indoors or wear an N95 mask if you have to be outside. Wash your produce with running water to remove outer leaves or peel any of the skin or outer layers of produce to get rid of any ash on the surface. Remember that eating leafy greens is nutritious, and ultimately nutrition builds your protective factors, your resilience to chemical exposures, and that there's a low risk of harm from produce that was exposed to smoke. And then take extra precautions if you're a child, if you're an older adult, if you're someone with respiratory or heart disease.